5 years after a very public spat, Canada and Saudi Arabia are restoring diplomatic relations. So, how did we get here? It was this 2018 tweet from then Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland that sent the bilateral relationship spiraling. Freeland called for the release of Raif and Samar Badawi, two Saudi activists imprisoned by the regime. The Saudi government was outraged and retaliated within hours, severing diplomatic ties and announcing economic punishments. 2 months later, a Saudi hit squad brutally murdered and dismembered dissident journalist Jamal Khashoggi in a Saudi consulate in Turkey. The U.S. concluded that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia, approved the operation himself. The episode turned the kingdom into a pariah state, but only temporarily. Last year, U.S. President Joe Biden traveled to Saudi Arabia in an effort to reset relations. And now Canada and Saudi Arabia say they're restoring relations, quote, on the basis of mutual respect and common interests. Here to discuss this reset in relations, Dennis Horak served as Canada's ambassador to Saudi Arabia from 2015 until his expulsion in 2018. Thomas Junot is a former Middle East analyst at the Department of National Defense. He's now an associate professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Dennis, start your thoughts on Canada and Saudi Arabia restoring these diplomatic relations. Is this the right thing to do?
I think it is. It's about time, actually. It's been nearly 5 years now, and I'm glad that we're having a reset on the relationship. I hope this is just the first step going forward, and that the normalization will lead to a more engaged relationship with the kingdom. I think there are interests that can be better served by engaging than by shunning.
Well, Thomas, the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia very likely ordered the murder and dismemberment of a journalist. Is this really a regime Canada should have formal relationships with?
Absolutely. I think there's a common misperception among some who criticize relations with Saudi Arabia or with others like Iran, for example, a debate we've had many times over the years. The point of diplomacy is not to reward your friends. It's not to hang out with people who agree with you. The point of diplomacy is to be there and to push for your own interest, whether it's human rights, trade, diplomatic security, or otherwise. On the human rights front, like on other fronts, Canada will be much better able to promote whatever it wants to achieve by having an ambassador on the ground than not.
But Dennis, human rights abuses, international hit teams, there's the war in Yemen. I mean, the Saudi regime doesn't tick really any of the boxes of a good actor on the world stage. So why shouldn't that be reflected in Canada's level of engagement?
Well, I think it can be reflected in our dialogue with them. I don't think it has to be reflected in our engagement. But look, there are countries around the world, Western countries, friendly countries that we have excellent relations with, that care as much about these issues as we do, and seem to be able to have a relationship, seem to be able to have a full diplomatic representation, seem to have full engagement with Saudi Arabia. We can too. It's an opportunity for us, if we have this engagement, if we have full level representation, where we can make our views known to the people, the senior people in Saudi Arabia who make these decisions. Can we change the world? No, but I think engaging with them provides an opportunity for influence. And it's as Thomas said, you don't just have diplomatic relations with nice countries. It's not a high school cafeteria where you only sit with the cool kids. It isn't. It's about, in fact, in some ways, it's more important to have relations with countries with whom you disagree in order to be able to convey those disagreements in a meaningful way, in a way that will be heard, and not some social media finger wagging.
Right. So, Thomas, because Canada, of course, is not alone in warming back up to the regime. I mean, it's just a couple of years ago that the U.S. turned Saudi Arabia into this pariah state, but now Joe Biden, he's traveled to Saudi Arabia to reset relations in 2022. Why is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia so important to the United States and to the West more broadly?
Well, Saudi Arabia is an important partner. It's one with which we have a lot of disagreements. We had them in the past. We're going to continue having them in the future. But it is the country with the largest hydrocarbon reserves in the world. It is an important security partner. It is an important partner in the Gulf. It is a rich country. So from the U.S. perspective, President Biden, or candidate Biden, I should say, at the time of the campaign in 2020, did campaign on making Saudi Arabia a pariah state. He did commit to that. But in practice, there was no chance that that was going to happen. Yes, there was a chilliness in the tone for maybe the first year or so when he came to power. But he realized, and his advisors around him realized, that they need to work with Saudi Arabia. There are areas of disagreement. There are areas where maybe I think the U.S. could and should tone down relations a bit, but there are other areas where these relations are necessary. So that I think the best approach here is not dogmatic binding yourself to Saudi Arabia, but being transactional. When there's something we need to work with the Saudis on, let's do it. When there's something where we disagree, let's say it. When there's something where it's costly to work with the Saudis, then let's take a step back.
You know, Dennis, China shadows over just about everything right now when it comes to geopolitics and diplomacy. It's got a growing involvement in the Middle East. How is that factoring into Canada's decision here in the geopolitics in the region?
Well, I'm not sure it's factoring in directly, but it is reflective of a world that's changing and changing international system and changing elite alliances and changing changing paradigms, if you will. So I think it's important for Canada to be in that game, at least in terms of understanding what's going on. China and is, as you said, being much more active in the Middle East, being much more active globally. Saudi Arabia itself is being much more assertive regionally. It's building back bridges to Iran, to Qatar, to Syria even. So it's important for us to have a sense of what's going on and to be able to perhaps influence, maybe only in a small way, but certainly influence to a degree, try and get a sense on what's going on, because what happens in that part of the world, whether we like it or not, affects us. It affects our trading partners, who are many of whom are very dependent on stability in the Gulf, so that the oil that they purchase can get out of the Gulf. And if it can't, if there's instability in the region and it affects our trading partners, that affects us. So we have a very strong interest in understanding what's going on there. What's China up to? What's Russia up to? What's Iran up to? And being in Saudi Arabia helps all of those.
Thomas, you talked about being transactional and exerting influence where you can. What are the sort of issues Canada could be transactional on with a country like Saudi Arabia, and what can they try to influence?
I think Canada has a number of interests that we can pursue with Saudi Arabia, keeping in mind something that sometimes gets a bit lost in these debates. Saudi Arabia is not a priority for Canada. Even before the 2018 dispute, trade was at about $4 billion per year. It's a reasonably important partner in the Middle East, but in the big picture, look at our priorities in Europe with the US in the Indo-Pacific, it's not. That being said, there are a few things. Educational exchanges. There were 14 or 15,000 Saudi students in Canadian universities before the dispute. That was useful, not only for Canadian universities, but having these students go back to Saudi Arabia after that as ambassadors. There's a trade potential, even if it's not massive. The Gulf states are very rich. So by having a stronger presence, having more cordial relations, there is potential for Canada to develop trade, not only with Saudi Arabia, but also with Qatar, the UAE, Bahrain, and others in the region. And the dispute with Saudi Arabia was not helping at that level. So in that sense, in the context where we are probably trying to decouple a bit our trade relationship with China, in a context where there's a lot of uncertainty on stability in the United States, Canada has a fundamental interest in the 2020s in diversifying our trade relations. The Gulf is not a miracle solution, but there are areas where we can certainly deepen trade at least a bit.
So Dennis, there's been no one there since you were declared persona non grata 5 years ago. What's Canada been missing in that half decade of absence in the kingdom?
When you don't have an ambassador, particularly in a country like Saudi Arabia, which is so top down, you need an ambassador to be able to reach into the decision-making corners of that country. A charge d'affaires is good in keeping the ship running, if you will, but Saudi Arabia is a very protocol-oriented country, and if you don't have an ambassador there, you can't reach the people that you need to reach, the decision makers, the people who know what's going on. Information tends not to filter down to the levels that it does, say, in Canada. Or other Western countries. So it's important to be able to have that sort of access. So I think that's what's been lacking. Also, the general tone, the general flavor it put on the relationship of not having a full relationship, I think affected us all across the board in terms of commercial activities, for example. But also, in one other point, just sort of following a bit on sort of this transactional notion that Thomas was talking about. Sure. One of the things that I think we've been hurt by over the last 5 years. Saudi Arabia is in the midst of a revolutionary reform program. It doesn't go far enough, certainly on the democratic side, but the social and economic reforms that are underway are massive. They're real, and Canada was contributing very significantly in a number of ways to that program. We were a favored partner in a number of sectors, for example, in education. having this impasse in our relationship, I think, affected that, and it's those sorts of contributions where we can make a difference on the ground in changing Saudi lives in a way that we've been pushing for, to make life easier, better, more diverse in terms of the workforce, all of those things, and I think that's been impacted negatively by the impasse we've had.
Okay, Dennis Horak, Thomas Junot, thank you so much for your time, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.